Well, hi crafters. So we've been having a lot of fun with embroidery. At least I have. I hope you're doing some of this too. So we've done several groups of stitches here. We've done our inline stitches, our crossed over stitches, we have knotted stitches. Now I'm going to move from my small hoop to that bigger one that was kind of living in the background. And we're going to do some more groups of stitches. So the next video I'm going to do is going to concentrate at the top here, and I'll zoom in. We'll do some blanket stitches, and that's coming up right now. And then after that, I'm going to do some satin stitches, some traveling stitches, I call them, just fancy stitches that move. And then we have some fancy flowers to do. And I think that covers a lot of the basics on stitches. So let's get started with those blanket stitches. Okay, now that we're all zoomed in here, I've got my needle threaded. I'm using DMC color number 718, and we're going to do a blanket stitch. So a blanket stitch starts by taking your needle and coming from back to front. Then you're going to take your needle and come at probably about a 45-degree angle onto the other line. Now you can either draw these lines or use imaginary lines, and just follow along. And you don't necessarily have to mark it up, but you want to make sure you do your best to keep your stitch consistency. That just makes everything look neater. So you're going to come in at that bottom line and then take your needle and bring it straight up back onto that top line. Wrap your needle with that thread and bring your needle or your thread through, catching that loop, and now you've got your first blanket stitch. So this stitch is going to have legs that come down this way, and then going across it's going to have a solid line. So we're going to repeat that by coming over here to the bottom, bringing your needle up on your line. Bring that thread around your needle so you'll catch the loop of thread. And that's your blanket stitch. So we'll do a few more of these so you can see it in action. Now when you've run the row of blanket stitches and you're finished, then you're just going to come right over your last loop, come over the loop on the other side of it, bring your needle down right next to it, and just lock that down. And that's your blanket stitch. So now we're going to move over just a little bit, and we're going to start a new stitch. We're going to start on that line again, and we're going to do a blanket stitch, but it's the alternating blanket stitch. Now you have two things you can alter here. You can alter, and we'll bring this up so I can use it as a pointer. You can alter the length of the stitch between the legs, or you can alter the length of the leg, or both. So on this altering stitch, you just start out the same way. You bring the needle from front to back, but I'm going to look at three existing optional lines here. I have the dotted line here, the solid line, and this dotted line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this line, the dotted line first, and I'm also making a much smaller leg, a much smaller stitch length going across horizontally. So we'll go ahead and bring that needle up. Now everything else repeats just the same. Bring that thread under that needle so you're within that loop, and bring it up. Now I'm going to go ahead and go down to the next length. So I'm going to come down here to my full. Now I'm still just going to go that short distance, a half stitch across. Come up on my line, wrap that thread around the needle, and bring it up. And now you can see it's stepping down. And then I'm going to go all the way down to my third mark Bring that up. And so you can see I have an alternating stitch. Now I'm going to throw in a little kicker here just so you can see it in action. Bring that up, it's a little tight. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is I've had a little half step each of the way here, but I'm going to bring it a full stitch, and I'm going to come back down to that first line. So I'm creating a little bit larger gap in between the groups of stitches. And that's the only thing I have to change, because everything else will just line up. So again, wrap your needle. Whoops. There you go. Bring that all up. And there you go. You're right back in position to create another set of 3. Now you can choose any number of stitches. You can go up and down. You can make designs out of this. So it's just a sampler that gives you a lot of options as far as what kind of a stitch you want to create. So again, I'm going to come down to that midline. And then all the way down to my baseline. Now when you get to your end stitch and you're done, you do the same thing. You just lock that stitch in. Make sure you come on the outside of the loop and lock it down. So there you go, 2 different blanket stitches already. A standard blanket stitch and an alternating blanket stitch. Okay, so I've got my needle rethreaded here with color number 444. And I'm going to show you 2 more blanket stitches on this next row. So you see 2 lines here that I've marked out. I'm going to use the bottom line as sort of my base line for this stitch. So I've brought my needle from back to front. And just like the blanket stitch, I'm going to come over at a 45-degree angle and bring my stitch in. Next, instead of coming in and capturing this loop right here, I'm actually going to come behind my stitch that I just placed, so almost right to the same point, and I'm going to bring my needle up, but I am going to capture that loop right here. So I've come up from here to the top, brought my needle back up right from this point, and I captured the loop, but it's just the tiniest little crossover, really almost imperceptible. Now I'm going to come over back to my point, and now I'm going to close that loop, and I'm going to be back at another 45-degree angle, so I'm going to be making sort of a triangle here. So that is the closed blanket stitch. So we'll do it again. So I'm coming up to my, I guess my apex. It's like a little tiny mountain there, right? So first I'm coming up, then I'm coming back into that loop, and this loop I have here, or back into this loop is what I mean, with my needle. Then this loop is going over the needle. So there's a little micro crossover there. There we go. Then I go right back in that same hole at the top. Then I'm going to bring that needle up. I'm making my little imaginary triangle. I'm just eyeballing that. And closing that up. So when you are done with your row, again, you just need to come on the outside of your last loop and make sure you lock it down. So come just right to the other side of it and lock it in. Now this next stitch, it's almost the same as the closed blanket stitch, except it's crossed over. It's called the crossed blanket stitch. So we'll start at this baseline on the bottom again, and we'll make our crossover. I will also bring my stitch up right here at this base and pick up that loop. But now I'm going to cross over instead of, and I should show you this parameter because I'm not coming all the way back here. I'm crossing over, making just a little, about halfway back, and then I'm going to come down again. So it's sort of a teepee shaped maybe. So I'm going to come in here, about halfway in between here and here, cross over and come into that baseline, extended from that stitch at an angle. Then this loop will get picked up, and so it's closed because we have our line here at the bottom that's going to be solid, but it's now a cross. Instead of meeting at the top, it just crosses over. So we'll do a few more of those and you can watch along. Again, when you get to the end, you've got your loose loop right here just hanging out over that end. So you want to bring that down and then make sure you go on the other side of it and lock it in. Okay, so you have a closed blanket stitch and a crossed blanket stitch. Okay, for these next two stitches, I went ahead and did a preliminary stitch because it's really just the basic blanket stitch. And I have to laugh at looking at how slanted my lines are. It is not as easy to do this when you have a camera and you have it top down as it is when you have it, you know, where you can hold it up and really look at it. So anyhow, don't mind my slanted lines, but what I've set up here is two ways to do double blanket stitches. So these first two I did just for information purposes with color number 911, 911, and that's DMC thread. And then I'm going to do the second half of it with this beautiful kind of burnt orange color number 720 so that you can see the difference on the two. So these are just two different ways to make double blanket stitches. The first, you would come in and start your line. Now I started with my closed line on the bottom, so now I'm going to start with the closed section of the line on the top. So I'm going to come into my stitch about halfway in between my bar because I want to kind of split the difference between each of these. So bring your needle through, then bring your needle in again halfway and right above that bar, depending on the direction of your stitch, above or below, and bring your needle again up halfway to catch that loop. So you're basically just doing two back-to-back blanket stitches and alternating them, and that's a double blanket stitch. once you finish, you just close your loop, anchor it just like you would any other blanket stitch or any other loop that needs to be locked in. And there you have it. Now you do have variety, of course, with any blanket stitch, where you could make the bar stitches, the stitches there, much shorter. You could make the legs shorter or longer. So you really could zip this up together and tighten it up where it's truly back to back. It would be quite a pretty stitch that way. So that's just an option for that. Now on this second version here, I'm going to do something completely opposite. This, I like to call it, it's a double stitch again, but I like to call it a zippered blanket stitch because I'm literally going to do like a mirror image of the blanket stitch. So this line right here is my line, these are my legs. So to make this stitch do the same thing, I'm going to start it at the same point, just right above it. And instead of coming down, I'm going to go up. And then I'm gonna stab it instead of trying to seam it because it's gonna be a little hard to get my needle right where I want it without the right angle to view it. So there we go. And the stitch should just be side by side. You should not be covering anything, so I have to be a little careful about that. Make sure you're just right above that. Give yourself some room for that stitch to show because you want to see both sides of it completely. You don't want to cover that up. So you can go ahead and just anchor this down like you would any other. Now, if for any reason you wanted to use, and I didn't do this with the green, but if you wanted to have the same finish on the other side, you still want to anchor your stitch first, but then you can just do a nice little back stitch here if you wanted the symmetry. And I would have done that with the green stitch as well, and then had a nice zippered stitch. So that is another double blanket stitch. So we have a mirrored or zippered blanket stitch and a double blanket stitch. Okay, I've got two more blanket stitches to show you. The first, I'm locked and loaded on some new thread. I've got color number 995 from the DMC color collection. And I'm going to do a knotted blanket stitch. So we're going to start on our baseline, and again do just your basic blanket stitch. And now once you're in this position, you're going to take your needle, which is on this side of the loop, and you're going to bring it under your stitch on the same side. And I'm kind of fighting with my hoop here, right on the edge there, but basically you bring it around, bring it under that leg, and if you really paid attention, that means this thread and this thread are both on that side of the loop. Okay? So you bring it under, you make one full turn, and then you pull your needle through. And what that does is it puts a nice little knot right on the top of your closure. So it's just a little twist on the blanket stitch. Makes a nice little knot there and gives it a little detail. So we'll do that a couple more times so you can see what I did. And hopefully I won't be fighting the rim of this embroidery hoop the whole way. So you bring your needle in at the top to your baseline. Loop your thread around the needle like you would always do. and you've now just made your blanket stitch. Now you're going to take your needle and come from the same side that this thread is coming out of. You're going to come under your stitch, not into the fabric, wrap one time, and then come up inside that loop. Get my hands out of the way so you can see what's happening. And it makes a tidy little knot. So you have that knotted blanket stitch. So I will do this several more times. I'll try and keep my hands out of the way so you can see what that thread is doing. Was the knotted blanket stitch. Now we're going to move right along to one last decorative blanket stitch, and that is the I call it the chain blanket stitch. So you're going to go ahead and again start with your baseline. Come on up at your angle. You're going to go ahead make your stitch, and then you're going to come right back next to your stitch, and you're going to make a little chain. Now I like to make them kind of down at an angle, just a small one. Take your working thread, bring it around your needle, and you just capture that chain. Then you go ahead and make your next stitch. So you go right back up to the line, wrap your stitch, then you're going to make inside your loop, you're going to make a small stitch at about a little angle. Be sure to wrap that and make a nice little chain stitch. So we'll do it again a couple more times. Okay, now that you're finished with your last chain, you close this out just like you would any other stitch. You've got your thread coming up inside that loop. You need to just go to the opposite side and anchor that down. Eight different alterations on a blanket stitch. You have your basic blanket stitch, altered blanket stitch, a closed blanket stitch, and a crossed blanket stitch. Two double stitches, one's a basic double stitch, one's I call zippered double stitch. You have a knotted blanket stitch and a blanket stitch that's got a chain accent, or a chained blanket stitch. So that's a great number of blanket stitches to have in your toolbox. So I hope you find that helpful, and I've got more videos coming up, so please be sure to subscribe, and if you click that little bell you'll get notifications when those videos come out. And if you like the video, please click like.